Oh, well, the Chequers deal doesn't work. It doesn't deliver Brexit, and it doesn't maintain the integrity of the single market. So the EU doesn't like it, and people who wanted to leave the European Union don't like it. Donald Tusk has merely repeated what Monsieur Barnier said a couple of weeks ago to the Brexit Select Committee, that the key parts of Chequers don't work from the EU's point of view, and the government needs to recognise that and come up with a better approach, which would be a Canada plus free trade deal, solving the Irish border on the basis set out by the European Research Group, which I chair last week.
Jacob Rees-Mogg. First question, do you agree with David Davis and Boris Johnson that the Prime Minister's proposed Chequers agreement doesn't deliver real Brexit?
Yes, I do. Over the weekend, I only raised questions on what had been agreed because I was surprised that members of the Cabinet had gone along with something that seemed on the face of it to be tying us into the European Union one way or another. And once David Davis and Boris Johnson set out their resignation reasons, it became clear that Brexit and Chequers are not the same thing.
It would certainly appear so. In his resignation letter, Boris Johnson has talked about how the dream is dying, suffocated by needless self-doubt, and saying it is as though we're sending our vanguard into battle with the white flags fluttering above them. It doesn't sound like Brexit is going to be delivered. So what are you going to do about it?
Well, there is some encouraging news, and that is that the law setting out our departure from the European Union is in place. So the Article 50 Act was passed before the general election, and the Withdrawal Act came into force about 2 weeks ago. That means that with nothing else happening, we would leave the European Union on the 29th of March next year without a deal. Any deal that the Prime Minister gets has to be voted through Parliament and voted into law. And if it's this bad deal from Chequers that keeps us in effectively the acquis communautaire, the EU rule book, which is subject to the European Court of Justice, for all the Prime Minister says, the European Court of Justice would remain effectively the Supreme Court in goods and agri-goods. And that won't get through Parliament. People like me will vote it down.
Have you got the numbers to vote it down?
Well, it depends what the opposition does. But if the Labour Party decides to support the government and have a sort of German-style grand coalition, then the government could get it through.
The Labour leadership has basically said, and certainly the likes of Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, has said basically, any deal is better than no deal. So it sounds like they would support it.
Well, I think there are considerable splits in the Labour Party. We'll have to see what the Labour Party does. But for a government to get its business through on the back of opposition votes is really unstable territory, because the opposition may vote for you one day, but it won't vote for you the next.
Given that the Prime Minister is saying one thing, and Michael Gove, another leading Brexiteer, the Environment Secretary, agrees with her and saying, yeah, look, this Brexit deal that we're offering, again, it's not a deal we've got with the EU. No one's bothered to actually, officially send it to the EU yet. We don't know what they're going to make of it. But even the new Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, again, another staunch Eurosceptic, is backing up to this deal. Is this a matter of interpretation when the likes of David Davis, Boris Johnson, yourself and others who say that this isn't Brexit in real life and this is Brexit in name only? Is it a matter of interpretation, or are either you or they lying to the British people?
I think you need to look at the nuance of what Michael Gove is saying. He said that he doesn't think the deal is everything that he hoped for. The reason he's accepted it is that he thinks that we can leave in law and then improve on the situation afterwards. Now, I happen to think that once we have an international treaty and it is legislated for, that will be extraordinarily difficult. So I don't think any Eurosceptic is saying this is a perfect deal. I think you'll find the Eurosceptics who've remained in the Cabinet are saying, well, they can live with this in the expectation of being able to get something better afterwards. In my view, the prospect of getting something better afterwards is unrealistic.
And in terms of the Eurosceptics who you represent, the European Research Group, is it, dozens and dozens of those MPs turned up for a meeting with you last night after the 1922 committee meeting with the Prime Minister. Many are very angry, very upset with the Prime Minister. A number of those ERG members said to me over the weekend they were going to be writing to the chair of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, to basically say a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister. We don't know how many letters he has. We won't know until he has 48. Do you know how many have written letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister?
No, I don't. I have no idea. I have no better idea than anybody else. And Sir Graham Brady's made it very clear that he will not give anybody any indication of how many letters he's received. He views it as a confidential matter unless and until he gets 48, at which point he has to announce it.
You've said that you would not support a vote of no confidence. In the event of a vote of confidence in the leadership of the Prime Minister, you would vote to support her. Why?
Well, what I said was that in a vote of confidence in the House of Commons, I would support the Prime Minister. That's because I don't want to have a general election. There isn't a vote of confidence in either case at the moment, but I don't think many people want to have another election. We've only had one a year ago, and a vote of confidence in the House of Commons under the Fixed Term Parliament Act potentially automatically precipitates a general election unless another government can be formed involving other people. So that's the vote of confidence that I would support the Conservative Party.
Are you putting...
What we want to focus on is how do we leave the European Union, and what's the best way of doing that? What is our solution? Our solution is Canada Plus on trade, which the EU has offered us. So that's already there in the bag for Great Britain. And how do you then extend it to Northern Ireland? And that's with our solution to the Irish border question.
Prime Minister says that there is no viable option apart, and her proposal, the Chequers deal, would protect jobs and livelihoods. She says it's the only viable option. If it's not accepted, then we will have no deal and we will drop out of the European Union. Should we potentially be looking at trying to extend the deadline for Article 50 to try to come up with some sort of deal, albeit if she calls you and says, come on, Jacob, come in to number 10 and we'll try and sort this out together?
Well, I think the beers and sandwiches approach worked pretty poorly in the 1970s, and I wouldn't want to see us go back to that. I think this idea that Chequers is the only viable deal is obviously not correct, because Chequers isn't viable. The EU was not going to accept it, and it's not leaving the European Union, and it won't protect jobs. It will deny us the opportunity to create jobs, because we will remain tied in to the failing European Union economic model, which has caused incredibly high rates of unemployment in other parts of the European Union. So it's not a viable model. It doesn't help us economically. Leaving on WTO terms, a world trade departure, is something that will not do us any harm and opens up opportunities for us to mould our own future. And I think British politicians and the British people can make good decisions for themselves.
Should we extend the deadline for Article 50?
No, definitely not. That would be, very administratively difficult, because you'd run into the European parliamentary elections, and the British seats in the European Parliament have already been reallocated to other countries. But also, British people voted to leave the European Union. The date we leave is the 29th of March. That's been passed into law twice now, and I think not to implement that law would be letting down the people who voted to leave, and would be a considerable failure of government policy.
Good morning.
You tweeted yesterday that the future of the country and the Conservatives depends on Brexit, meaning Brexit. Under this deal, does Brexit still mean Brexit?
Well, I think this deal raises a number of questions. So far we've seen 3 pages out of 120, and we will have to find out what the details mean. For example, a common rule book. Now, on day one, that common rule book is the common rule book of the European Union, is the acquis communautaire as it applies to goods including agri-foods. How will that change? How will it become a joint rule book between the UK and the EU? There's the absolutely crucial point on due regard paid to EU case law as the UK courts interpret this agreement. What does that mean? What role does that give for the European Court of Justice? And then on the customs arrangement, if we're the tax collector for the EU, how are they going to regulate that? Will it bring OLAF in? Will it bring a new regulatory body into the UK, well, an existing regulatory body, and give it standing in the UK?
These are all important and interesting questions, but they're detailed ones. Only yesterday, or the day before, when the plan was leaked, you said this is not Brexit and the government should rip it up. Now, they haven't. They've endorsed it. So what's changed?
Hold on. What I said should be ripped up was a specific page that was reported saying that if we did this, we wouldn't be able to do a trade deal with the United States.
Well, do you believe that we would, under this, be able to do a deal with the United States?
But that is a page of the 120-page report that I haven't yet seen whether it's still there or not. So that's why I'm being slightly cautious. But to be absolutely clear, this will require legislation. And if when we get the detailed legislation, it turns out that it's a punishment Brexit, that it is keeping us in the European Union in all but name, I will stick to the Conservative Party's manifesto commitments and will not vote for it. So that's why we've got to wait and see what the detail says and whether this is Brexit meaning Brexit, in which case many people will be willing to go along with it, or whether in fact it means that we're losing the advantages of Brexit, not getting the freedoms that we were promised, and being tied in to an arrangement that means we're a rule taker.
Now, it's clear to me, Mr. Reese Mogg, that you've significantly changed your tone over the space of a couple of days. Now, no doubt because all the Cabinet Brexiteers have now signed up to a plan that they too condemned in private just 24 hours ago. Have you spoken to anybody who was at that Cabinet meeting to discover what on earth went on?
No, I haven't had the opportunity to do that.
Do you think they were right to stay in the Cabinet?
Well, I can't say whether they were right or not until I've seen the full detail of the papers. That's the issue, is that do the papers as a whole, the whole 120 pages of it, indicate a reasonable Brexit that commits to answers the Prime Minister's promises, or have the red lines been turned pink?
Well, let's look at one of your specifics, the Common Rule Book. The Common Rule Book, we don't need the detail. Do we know what the Common Rule Book means? What it means is effectively staying in the single market for goods. So people who are hoping, manufacturers who sell most of their goods outside the EU and might have been hoping for a different set of rules to allow them to compete with people in China, for example, will not be allowed to do it. They will have to stick to European rules. Does that mean Brexit means Brexit?
If your interpretation is correct, it would also make trade deals almost impossible, because we would be applying those rules to goods coming into the UK. And in trade deals, non-tariff barriers are more important than tariff barriers. And we need to have the flexibility to accept equivalence of rules from other nations, that to say that other nations have standards that may be achieved differently, but achieve the same end result. If your interpretation is correct, that is not something that when it comes to legislation I will vote for. I will stick to the Conservative Party's manifesto commitments, because this is where the advantages of Brexit come from, dealing with the 90% of growth that's coming from outside the European Union in future decades.
If every newspaper and every commentator is right that this represents what people often call a soft Brexit, in other words, something rather close to many of the arrangements we currently have with the EU, would you believe that such a deal was better or worse than no deal at all?
No deal is better than a bad deal. And the thing to remember...
But this deal, this deal is what matters.
Well, we don't have all the details on this detail.
It is possible that this deal is worse than no deal, is it?
As with eggs, an egg that is very softly boiled isn't boiled at all. A very soft Brexit means we haven't left, we simply are a rule taker. That is not something that this country voted for. It's not what the Prime Minister promised. The Prime Minister will, I'm sure, stick to her word. That is crucially important. But I will certainly stick to the Conservatives' manifesto commitments and will not vote for something that doesn't deliver Brexit.